Imagine a ruler, an emperor, inviting a father to a spectacular banquet. The air is heavy with the smell of roasted meat and fine wine. But the father can't eat. He can barely breathe. Just hours earlier, this same emperor had his son executed. And now, he sits across the table, watching the father's face, scanning for any flicker of grief, any sign of a soul that isn't completely broken. This isn't a scene from some horror movie. This is a story told about Gaius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, the Roman emperor we all know as Caligula. For centuries, his name has been a byword for madness, cruelty, and pure depravity. But just calling him insane misses the real horror of his 4-year reign. According to the ancient writers who hated him, these weren't random fits of madness. They were calculated steps in a terrifying machine, built to dismantle the human spirit. The stories say Caligula weaponized everything, public parties, private grief, even the law itself, to systematically break the will of Rome's most powerful people. He didn't just want to rule their bodies, he wanted to own their souls. Today, we're looking beyond the caricature of the mad emperor. We'll explore the 5 most horrifying intimate acts blamed on Caligula, not as random cruelties, but as twisted components of a system of psychological terror. But here's the million-dollar question we have to ask: are these horrifying stories fact, or are they fiction? The juiciest accounts of Caligula's reign come from sources like Suetonius, Cassius Dio, and Seneca, historians and philosophers who were writing with a clear, hostile agenda. Modern historians see much of what they wrote as exaggerated, gossip-filled, or even straight-up slander, designed to destroy a hated emperor's reputation after his death. So as we break down these 5 acts, we have to keep asking ourselves, are we looking at the real Caligula, or are we staring at a monster carefully crafted by his enemies? Before the monster, there was a boy named Gaius. He was the son of Germanicus, a hero general beloved by all of Rome, and Agrippina the Elder, granddaughter of the great Augustus himself. He was basically imperial royalty, the darling of the army. As a little kid on military campaigns with his dad, he wore a mini-soldier's outfit, complete with tiny military boots, or caligi. The soldiers nicknamed him Caligula, meaning little boots, a cute name that would stick with him for the rest of his life. But his happy childhood was an illusion, one that was shattered by the brutal politics of the imperial court. His father died suddenly, rumored to have been poisoned on the orders of the paranoid emperor, Tiberius. Then his mother and 2 older brothers were arrested, exiled, and eventually starved or forced to die by that same emperor. Young Caligula survived by being sent to live with the very man who destroyed his family, Tiberius, on the lonely island of Capri. For years, he was a virtual prisoner, learning to hide his true feelings, to play the part of an obedient ward, and to study cruelty as a tool for survival. Some ancient historians claim this is where Caligula learned to smile at his enemies, a skill he'd later turn into a weapon. When Tiberius finally died in 37 AD, Rome threw a party. The 24-year-old Caligula, the last surviving son of his celebrated family, was welcomed as a savior. And for 7 glorious months, he was exactly that. He stopped Tiberius's treason trials, brought back exiles, threw lavish games for the people, and started ambitious building projects, like new aqueducts for Rome. It looked like a golden age had finally dawned. Then, about 8 months into his reign, Caligula got terribly sick. The whole empire held its breath, praying he'd recover. He did. But the man who came back was different. The ancient sources tell us that the charming, generous boy emperor was gone, replaced by someone dark, paranoid, and utterly unrestrained. This is where the stories of his downfall begin, a descent that, whether real or exaggerated, would cement his horrifying reputation for all time. The first turn of this alleged machine of terror wasn't an act of violence, but an act of love, twisted into a tool of control. Caligula adored his sister, Drusilla. Now, the exact nature of their relationship is juicy. Hostile sources like Suetonius claim they were incestuous lovers. Modern historians, though, mostly see these claims as baseless, a common political smear used in ancient Rome to discredit your enemies. What we know for sure is that he loved her deeply. In 38 AD, Drusilla died, probably from a fever that was sweeping through Rome. Caligula was devastated. But his reaction went far beyond personal grief. He decided that the entire Roman Empire would be forced to share his pain. He had the Senate officially deify his sister, making her Diva Drusilla, the first imperial woman ever to be made a goddess. He even gave her the divine title Panthea, which means all-goddess. Then, he declared a justicium, a period of legally required public mourning across the whole empire. And according to the hostile sources, the rules were absolute and terrifying. During this time, laughing was supposedly a capital crime. Taking a bath was forbidden. Even dining with your own family, your parents, your wife, your kids, was said to be punishable by death. Can you imagine living in a city where the government dictates your emotions? A place where a moment of private joy or a simple act of hygiene could get you executed? That's the horror story the ancient writers wanted their readers to believe. But let's put on our critical glasses. How much of this is really true? The deification of Drusilla is a historical fact, backed up by inscriptions. The period of public mourning also definitely happened. However, the idea that private happiness was criminalized to this extreme is seen by most modern scholars as a wild embellishment by writers like Suetonius. It's highly unlikely that Romans were actually being executed for laughing. Instead, this story was probably designed to make a point, that Caligula was a tyrant who didn't just control what his subjects did, but what they felt. It was a story crafted to show an emperor blurring the line between God and man, turning his personal pain into state-enforced misery. If the first act criminalized private joy, the next one, as his enemies told it, was meant to destroy public dignity. This is probably the most infamous and shocking story told about Caligula, a tale of organized degradation so disgusting it has defined his legacy for 2,000 years. The ancient historians Suetonius and Cassius Dio claim that Caligula, needing money, opened a brothel right inside the imperial palace. But this wasn't any ordinary brothel. The story goes that it wasn't staffed by slaves or common prostitutes. It was allegedly staffed by the wives and children of Rome's most powerful citizens, the senators and equestrians. The accounts get even more specific, and more grotesque. They claim the brothel was advertised in public, with imperial messengers announcing its services all over the city. They even allege that books were kept, carefully recording the names of the clients and the performances of the noblewomen and their children. If this were real, the psychological damage would have been catastrophic. In Roman high society, family honor, dignitas, and lineage were everything. This alleged brothel wasn't just about sexual assault, it was about the total destruction of a family's name. It would have meant that a senator's wife or daughter was not just violated, but her humiliation was recorded and turned into a state-run business, their names forever listed in the emperor's finance books. Okay, but did this really happen? Of all the wild stories about Caligula, this is the one that makes modern historians the most skeptical. There is no independent evidence, no archaeological proof, no mention in more neutral sources. Suetonius, our main source, was writing decades after Caligula died and was known for loving scandalous gossip more than hard facts. Accusing a political rival of sexual depravity, especially of prostituting freeborn women, was a standard and powerful political smear in Rome. It was the ultimate slander. It's far more likely the story of the palace brothel isn't literal truth, but a vicious piece of propaganda. It might be a powerful metaphor his enemies created to symbolize how Caligula, as they saw it, prostituted the honor of the Roman elite and treated the Senate like his personal property. It wasn't a real brothel of bodies, but a story designed to paint a picture of a brothel of souls, with Caligula as the master. While the brothel was almost certainly a fabrication, the mind games Caligula played with the Senate were very real, even if we're seeing them through the eyes of his enemies. His reign was defined by a deep, mutual hatred with the senatorial class. He saw them as hypocrites, and he seemed to enjoy reminding them just how powerless they were. The imperial banquet became his favorite stage for this psychological warfare. The philosopher Seneca, one of Caligula's most bitter enemies, gives us a chilling account of these dinners. He describes how Caligula would have the wives of his senatorial guests paraded in front of him during the meal. He would look them over, judging them like cattle, sometimes commenting on their looks or flaws right in front of their husbands. Then, the story goes, he would pick a woman, take her from the dining room to his chambers, and after a while, come back to the party. He'd sit back down at the table and proceed to give a graphic, critical review of her performance in bed to her husband and all the other guests. The husband, meanwhile, was trapped. He had to sit there, smile, and maybe even thank the emperor for the honor. Any other reaction, a flash of anger, a hint of shame, would mean instant death for him and likely his entire family. He had to be a willing, even grateful, part of his own public humiliation. This alleged ritual wasn't about sex. It was a cold, calculated performance of dominance. It was a theater of terror designed to tear down the authority and masculinity of Rome's most powerful men. By violating their wives and forcing the husbands to play along, Caligula was showing them in the most intimate way possible that everything they cared about, their honor, their families, their very sense of self, was his to play with. Again, you have to consider the source. Seneca hated Caligula, and this story is told as a moral lesson. Whether this happened regularly or is just an exaggerated tale based on one incident is impossible to know. But the story stuck because it perfectly captured what people believed Caligula's tyranny was like. It showed how he used intimacy not for connection, but as a weapon to destroy the trust and respect that held the Roman elite together. Of all the acts of psychological cruelty blamed on Caligula, one story attacks the very core of human love and grief. It's another story from Seneca, an anecdote so monstrous it's almost hard to believe. It's about Caligula's alleged protocol for fathers whose sons he had sentenced to death. According to Seneca's essay on anger, it wasn't enough for Caligula to just execute a man's son. The father was ordered to be there and watch the execution. But the horror didn't stop there. Right after watching his child die, the grieving father would be summoned to a banquet with the emperor that very same night. At the dinner, Caligula would reportedly push wine and food on the father, and just watch him. He'd study the man's face for any sign of sadness, any tear, any hint of the agony that must have been tearing him apart. The father was in an impossible bind. To show grief was to show defiance, to silently condemn what the emperor had done. This would be seen as disloyalty and would get him killed. So, he had to pretend to be happy. He had to eat, drink, and make small talk with his child's murderer, all while the image of the execution was burned into his mind. Seneca tells the specific story of a man named Pastor, whose son was executed. That night, Pastor went to the emperor's feast. Seneca writes that Caligula offered him a glass of wine and had a man watch him. The poor father went through with it, feeling as though he were drinking his son's blood. He had to participate in a celebration on the same day he wasn't even allowed to properly bury his son. Did this happen exactly as Seneca described? Like all these stories, it's debatable. It's a single anecdote from a deeply biased source, not some documented policy. But its power isn't in its literal truth. It represents the ultimate form of psychological torture, weaponizing the sacred bond between a parent and child. It paints a portrait of an emperor who got power not just from killing, but from forcing his victims to deny their own humanity. Caligula's machine of humiliation worked brutally well on Rome's politicians. They were men used to compromise, to swallowing their pride to survive. But the fatal mistake that would cost him his life was assuming this would work on everyone. He made the mistake of trying it on a soldier. Cassius Chaerea was a senior officer, a tribune in the elite Praetorian Guard. He was a veteran soldier, a man of action and old-school Roman military honor. He also, according to the sources, had a high-pitched voice, which Caligula found hilarious. For years, Caligula publicly and relentlessly humiliated Chaerea. He mocked his voice, taunted him with insults about being effeminate, and made him a running joke among the other guards. According to Suetonius, the main tool for this humiliation was the daily password. When it was Chaerea's turn to get the password from the emperor, Caligula would deliberately give him obscene or unmanly words, like Priapus, for the god of fertility, or Venus, which was slang for a eunuch. When Chaerea came to thank the emperor, Caligula would supposedly offer his hand to be kissed, but form it into an obscene gesture. For a senator, this kind of shame was survivable. But for a soldier like Chaerea, whose authority depended on the respect of his men, it was poison. Every insult, every demeaning password, chipped away at his honor in front of his own troops. Caligula was playing the same game he played with the senators, but with a man who stood next to him every day wearing a sword. He assumed fear would always win. He didn't understand that for a man like Chaerea, there comes a point where the fear of dishonor is greater than the fear of death. That point came in January of 41 AD. After years of this torment, Chaerea had enough. He became the core of a conspiracy that included other fed-up guards and senators. Historians widely agree on the motivation. It was a direct response to the deep and personal humiliation Caligula had inflicted on him. The most intimate act of cruelty, the daily, grinding destruction of one man's pride, turned out to be the most dangerous one. The machine of terror had finally pushed a victim too far, and now, it was about to turn on its creator. On January 24, 41 AD, during the Palatine Games, the machine finally broke. As Caligula was walking through a secluded underground tunnel beneath the palace, the conspirators attacked. Cassius Chaerea struck the first blow. As Caligula fell, the other conspirators swarmed in, stabbing him over and over. Ancient sources claim he was stabbed 30 times. The violence didn't stop there. The assassins, bent on wiping out Caligula's entire line, stormed the palace. They found his wife, Milonia Sasonia, and murdered her. Then they found their daughter, Julia Drusilla, a toddler named after Caligula's beloved sister. They killed the child by smashing her head against a wall. In the chaos that followed, the Senate actually talked about restoring the Roman Republic. But the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's own bodyguards, had other plans. While looting the palace, they found a terrified man hiding behind a curtain. It was Caligula's uncle, Claudius, a man everyone had long written off as a harmless fool. The soldiers declared him the new emperor, and the Senate, facing the guards' swords, had no choice but to agree. Cassius Chaerea, the man who killed a tyrant to end tyranny, was executed by the new emperor, Claudius. His deed might have been seen as noble, but the precedent of a guard killing his emperor couldn't be allowed to stand. The monster was dead, but the machine, the system of absolute imperial power, had already found its next driver. So, We're left with the ghost of Caligula, a figure wrapped in horrifying legends. We've looked at the 5 key acts that define his reputation: the enforced grief for his sister, the rumored palace brothel, the humiliating banquets, the torture of grieving fathers, and the relentless mocking that led to his own murder. But as we've seen, the history is complicated. The most shocking stories come from biased sources and are probably exaggerations or even fabrications, designed as political character assassination. Caligula was almost certainly a cruel, arrogant, and unstable ruler who terrorized the Roman elite. But the monster described by Suetonius and Seneca is also a literary creation, a caricature of tyranny. The true, undeniable horror of Caligula's reign might not be in any single act he's accused of. It's in what he represented. He was the first emperor to fully show the terrifying potential of absolute power, the power to declare yourself a god, to treat the state like your personal property, and to use the government as a tool for psychological warfare. He showed that one man could try to legislate emotion, erase dignity, and weaponize love itself. And maybe the most chilling part of his story is that the system he abused didn't die with him. The assassination of Caligula didn't bring back the Republic, it just put Claudius on the throne. The blueprint for tyranny survived. Future emperors like Nero and Domitian would walk the path Caligula had cleared. The machine outlived the monster. Caligula's legacy is a timeless warning. It's a story about how easily power, when it's all in one person's hands and unchecked by law or morality, can corrupt not just the ruler, but the very soul of the state he commands.